This option will become active during deployment on the fields of battle. Additionally, while equipment can be freely built and moved about on days 1, 2, and 4 of Dungeon Wars, new equipment cannot be deployed, and equipment cannot be removed from the fields of battle on days 3 and 5. Whatever a dungeon has committed to battle is what the dungeon must utilize come the days of those battles. Be prepared, be creative, and be victorious. So, James was doing some quick math in his head since he now knew what numbers he would be working with. It irritated him that the company behind DCO, aka Xander, had essentially forced him and Blank to compete in this dungeon war, though James also realized his own actions had led to it. Blank had taunted him, and James had responded. Had he not done as they did and jumped in ranking so quickly to climb into being a Tier 3 dungeon, well, he might have been safe from Blank for a day or two IRL, which would have given his players even more time to grow and explore. That being said, James knew there was no use worrying about that fact, and instead he needed to focus on the now. With a glance at his clock, he knew he still had a little over a day and a half of immersion before Blank's players were in and the war began. That was the advantage James had of being in a different time zone than Blank. It also meant James's players would get 1 day of adventuring and preparation, whereas Blank's players were going to log in and be in the war the moment they started their immersion. James figured that was why the wars had the first 2 days as an invasion period, so that there wasn't an overwhelming advantage to waging war against other time zones, especially because, in the future, dungeons would have plenty of time to prepare themselves for a war. With his quick math done, James knew that from day 1 and 2 of the war he would earn a total of 480 BP in both offense and defense. That meant he could spread it evenly or utilize a total of 960 points in a single option. The difficulty was that with the number of probes he had, he would really have to be picky with what he was building to ensure that it started in time to even be done and ready to deploy before day 3 started. He figured, based on what he could tell of Blank and its player base, that they would be coming at him hard on day 3, likely intending to do as much damage and demoralize him as much as they could. That meant, despite his initial plan, he was going to need to be a bit defensive. Luckily enough for him, he already had a giant freaking shield for his core, and logically he could use the other 960 points to at least build up some walls and barricades for his players. Of course, as Rue had pointed out to him, being logical was possibly not the correct way to overcome Blank. Instead, James already had a plan forming, one that would most likely throw Blank off their groove and help him keep the singular advantage he felt he had. If he was going to view this as a PvE event, it didn't make sense for him or his players to completely turtle it up. No, there were mobs and a boss to slay, and he was going to do just that. James mentally started scanning over his build options, placing notes on what he wanted to do and how he was going to do it. Afterward, he figured it would be wise to get some sleep in-game and then hop into training as his avatar while his adventurers joined back in and began exploring. It was going to be his and their last day of freedom before the war started. Chapter 34.
It seems they are rushing to get to your 3rd floor.
Rue's comment pulled James from his concentration, which resulted in one of his sacrificial lambs falling into the pit he had been guiding it over. The moment it fell, it exploded. The pit was, after all, filled with spikes. James was in the process of seeing just how much control he could have over his pet mobs and had enacted an obstacle course to test each of his mobs out on. Probably wanting to level up and gain as much gear as they can before the war. James wiped the sweat off his brow with his glowing left arm, marveling for a second at the patterns of swirling energy on it. He had started to notice that as he summoned mobs, the strange runes would start to shift and change, though he had only experimented slightly with that feature of his class. He was almost 100% positive it was just an aesthetic change put into the game. However, the gamer in him screamed that there was a chance it was something secret, and he needed to find out what.
How do you think they're going to do against the Terminus?
Rue's comments were in relation to the new and improved Knights Who Go Knee, as well as Scar's group, which had finally seemed to create a guild of their own. Before, while they had all played with each other, James had found it interesting that they weren't actually a guild. This time around, it seemed that had changed. Now, next to all of their names, a guild tag appeared. Boss Slayers was their guild name. Rather unoriginal in James's eyes, but fitting since they did gain a world first alongside the Knights when they defeated the Terminus. Of course, what amused James was the tag shortened to BS, which he was certain had been intentional on their part. After all, their archer's name was trolled. I'm pretty sure they'll win again. This wasn't going to be the second or even third time that they'd faced Terminus and won. Last immersion, the Knights had all climbed into level 30, gaining them all another subclass to choose from. James knew the subclasses offered quite the power boost, and seeing what they had chosen when they all reached 30, this next evolution had cemented in their strengths even more. That had also been the first time James had gotten to see a secret class unlocked. It had all started out normal enough. They had defeated the Terminus, and in doing so, their party had leveled up to level 30. James and Rue had cheered for all of them, especially because, by the way their faces lit up, it seemed they had gained another achievement for hitting level 30. This had been their 5th or 6th time defeating the Terminus since the original raid that brought the boss down, and they were getting used to him. Even his advanced AI could only change up how the lumbering T-Rex could fight in so many different ways. Add in the fact that Scar's gang accompanied them almost every time, and, well, Sir Rexus just didn't stand much of a chance. When they had all next entered the dungeon, though, James had eagerly inspected all of them, wanting to see what options they had taken. After all, he had done his research on all of their classes and knew what the logical choices would be for each one to take, and while they were often eccentric, they played in a very professional, well-thought-out way. They were veteran gamers. James knew that for sure now. Z, at level 30, had become a Beastmaster. That was a Ranger subclass, which fit Z in more ways than James was sure the old man would care to admit. Mainly because, while everyone had initially mocked him for acquiring Badgie, that badger was now quite loved by the group. As a Beastmaster, Z had the ability to further buff Badgie and enhance the pet to help the team even more. It also gave him the ability to summon an additional full-time pet from a different tree. For Rangers, James had found, the pet that was summoned was random. James knew the frustration of that. For Beastmasters, they could choose to summon a random mob from one of 4 tree choices. The first was offense, the second was defense, the third was balanced, and the fourth was wild. A wild pet had higher stats than the others would, and could be from any of the other 3 trees. However, wild pets were just that. They had more willpower than the regular pets, and would act in the way they thought was best, rather than how the Beastmaster ordered it to. In old-school terms, if you didn't have enough badges, it wasn't going to listen to you. Z, of course, had gone wild, because why wouldn't he? The result, to everyone, including Z's amusement, was a giant eagle. And giant was the appropriate word. The eagle was large enough it seemed it could pick up Z if it wanted to. It could pick up Badgie, as James had noted on more than one occasion, Z ordering the wild eagle to pick up Badgie and carry the badger towards a boss or mini-boss. Sometimes the eagle did just that. Other times it let out a loud squawk and promptly did its own thing. Z, it seemed, did not have enough badges just yet for the eagle's full cooperation. Next had been Elm. He also had chosen the path James had expected for him. Previously, he had been an arcane archer. The subclass that best suited an arcane archer was to simply continue down the magical path. There was a subclass for arcane archer called elemental archer. It essentially allowed the user to modify which types of magical arrows were used and gave those arrows unique damage types and conditions depending on the option chosen. It was a versatile class that would give Elm the opportunity to always have an answer to whatever problem he saw. From there, James figured he would go the sniper route, which would increase the range and damage that he could do with his attacks. But level 40 was still a ways off for the group. Faust had continued his pursuit of even more magical attacks and damage. His first subclass had, of course, been choosing to become a lightning mage. From there, he seemed to have chosen the war mage subclass, making him a lightning war mage. War mages were able to amplify their magical spells more, and also had a neat feat that allowed them to decrease their casting time on spells by increasing the amount of MP they spent on it, meaning he could get stronger spells off more quickly if he had the mana for it. The healer, Medic, continued to play his role well, and was now a high cleric of the light. The light, obviously, being the optimal healing class for clerics, and being a high cleric just meant he got even more healing spells. It also had a neat mass revive cooldown, as well as some really strong mass heals. Mass heals and revives were extremely important, given the party's habit of being reckless and trying to take down challenges for instance first achievements. Finally came Oak, the warrior turned shielder. Oak, the reluctant tank who hated his role, but did it for the greater good of the party. Well, he had apparently gotten fed up with that, because there was no other way James could think of that he would have stumbled across his secret class otherwise. Now, normally, the logical progression from warrior to shielder was a class called a juggernaut, a massive, super tanky class that could become a mobile, walking fortress of armor and pain. It was a great class with strong damage mitigation skills and a large boost to HP max and defense. However, Oak must not have wanted to be a juggernaut. A shame, because James actually had been looking forward to seeing Oak as one. That and the title was just awesome. Instead, as Oak had stepped into the instance, his appearance and his class had caused James and Rue to just stare in silence. Oak, apparently, had decided he was done being just a straight tank because he was not a juggernaut. Granted, he still had his Triceracog shield and was still wielding BLU's chainsword. But now, around his entire form, magical energy seemed to crackle, and his elven eyes glowed with electrical power. The class seemed more a name than a title, as it simply had the word Indra listed, which James learned later, as the group discussed Oak's class, was a secret class. With all 5 of them above level 30, and with the explosive and amazing defensive capabilities of Oak's new class, the party could likely take on Terminus and have no problems. However, they had opted to keep training alongside Scar's group, which was why, as James saw the party once again moving together towards his second-floor boss, he couldn't help but grin. The fight would likely be over quickly, and Scar's group was probably going to hit level 30 from it. But that just meant they were going to all be quite confident of their abilities as they moved to his 3rd floor. And James was really looking forward to them seeing his 3rd floor. Chapter 35. "Till next time, then, good chaps," the Terminus called out as his HP hit 0 and his massive form toppled to the ground. "'Tis always a blast." The light from his eyes faded, and James and Rue watched as the group of adventurers all turned and ran. For anyone new to the dungeon, they would likely be confused at the odd occurrence. But for veterans of the 2nd floor and the Terminus boss fight, this was standard practice. After all, no one wanted dino aids. All 10 members of the raid team cleared the 25-yard radius before the core detonated, ensuring they were safe from dino aids yet again. James was mildly disappointed, as while he hadn't spent much time looking over his disease menu, he had found out he could at least increase how diseases spread. He had upgraded the disease to give it an increased chance to spread via proximity with players and had been hoping to see what would happen if it spread around more. So far, he knew that Dino AIDS was a permanent per-instance debuff that players could receive when the Terminus detonated. It halved all of their stats and had to be either cleansed by a high-level spell or faded away when players left a dungeon. James was still curious if it carried over to other floors and what else he could do with it. Other than upgrading Dino AIDS and some of his 1st floor ailments, he was limited right now. The tab didn't have much to it and seemed to need players to be afflicted by ailments a certain number of times before the disease leveled up and gave him more tools to play with. Much like the diseases he was manipulating, upgrades evolved based on how many victims they were spread to, which was cool but also slightly terrifying. A reminder of the 2020s that was still covered in history classes. "Guys, the timer's not starting, which means there is a new floor." Z had regrouped with his party around the Terminus's scrapped body. Everyone was looting the boss and checking their own stat windows, likely checking their experience gains, and seeing what they had gotten from the boss. Z's statement caused a visible change in the air around them, excitement growing in their eyes. James was having a hard time taking them seriously, as they were all wearing the top hats that the Terminus dropped. He knew its ability to decrease the needed number of set gear pieces by 1 was why they all wore them, but still, it was slightly ridiculous, in a classy sort of way. Plus, He knew they'd farmed the floor enough that they likely had all the pieces they needed, without the hats. Just like the demonic farmer, the Terminus had a % chance to drop pieces of loot and set gear each time he was defeated. Obviously, all of the players knew that, and as such, that had been a big part of the grind on the second floor for the higher-leveled players in the dungeon. In addition to that, BLU also dropped set gear for players, and you could actually mix or match the pieces in order to get the same buff. So while players might not have a matching set, they could still get the buff for having 6 pieces of gear. The incentive for having a complete matching set, other than just being cosmetic, was that BLU's gear and the Terminus's gear was actually geared for different types of players. BLU's gear was lighter, offering lower protection, but also giving a buff to magic and ranged players for their attack damage. Conversely, the Terminus's gear was bulkier, providing a higher defense stat and a boost to HP for tanky and melee-type classes. Because of the fact that Z and Scar's parties had been clearing the dungeon together since the middle of the last instance, they had managed to defeat both bosses enough times that they had traded around and ensured each member was now wearing the appropriate gear for their respective classes. For the lighter armored classes and magic users, their gear consisted of tight, padded leather armor with various scraps of metal thrown in as protective plates. The armor was well insulated, offering resistance to magical and elemental attacks, and increased their ranged and magical attack damage by an additional 3%. What James liked about the BLU set was that it had metal spikes, almost like a spine, that ran down the back. The gloves of the set had the steampunk raptor-like claws built into them. The boots, as well, had the same claws. The helmet, James knew, was molded to look like a Velociraptor head, but everyone seemed to really enjoy their top hats. The Terminus gear consisted of leather armor that was then insulated and covered with metal plates. It was large, intimidating, and bulky. To augment the armor, there were various gears placed along the joints, as well as what appeared to be steam-powered pistons that almost seemed to aid the adventurers in their movement, as otherwise it would seem ridiculous for them to be wearing such heavy armor. It gave the wearers a very visual sense of being a tank. Add to that the chainsword from BLU, as well as the Triceracog shield, and tank players really were intimidating. There was also a player James had noticed that was running around dual-wielding chainswords and who had opted to wear the full BLU armor. James's amusement, that player wore the helmet too, which just made him all the more aesthetically terrifying. That was one of the things James always loved about MMOs. Players could always craft their character however they wanted. Any suggestions on multi-class options before we head to the third floor? Scar was looking at his character screen, his face deep in thought. Around him, his party members were all doing the same. As James had figured, they had all leveled up, hitting that level 30 mark and earning themselves a new class option. James lazily scanned Z's stats for a moment, curious how the Knights Who Go Knee were doing level-wise. Z, level 32 Beastmaster. Archer, Ranger, Beastmaster. 86,109 total XP earned. 3,409 current XP held. 3,391 XP to next level. HP, 320. 184 plus 46 plus 65 plus 25. AP, 255. 184 plus 46 plus 60 plus 20. Attack, 354. 155 plus 30 plus 10 plus 39 plus 75 plus 40 plus 5. Magical attack, 0. Defense, 159. 64 plus 30 plus 16 plus 30 plus 19. Magical defense, 25. 20 plus 5. Minus 15% from magical and elemental attacks before magical defense is applied. It seemed that each subclass granted players an increase in stats for the next 10 levels, and then was replaced by the next subclass. As such, it seemed Z was getting an additional 65 HP from his Ranger subclass, and another 25 from his Beastmaster subclass, which was fitting, considering James knew the extra HP would come in handy against his latest and greatest mobs. He was also pleased to see that Z's attack had continued to grow. The good news for the adventurers was that they could, in theory, handle the basic unupgraded mobs on James's third floor. The bad news was they wouldn't even be able to scratch his boss with their basic attacks. Of course, that's what skills and ingenuity were for. The other members of Z's party, James already knew, were similarly boosted. In fact, Oak's HP was now over 500, and his defense was ridiculous at just over 300. The guy was the embodiment of a tank, and that was before his passive skills came into play when it came to damage mitigation. His Indra class, James had discovered, gave him a constant passive damage reduction of 20% after the damage had gone against his armor. It was called Thunder God's Aura. That same aura gave all of his attacks an additional 3% of magic thunder damage. Secret classes were definitely the way to go, if you could find them. Well, there's obviously the logical choices. Z motioned towards most of his party, all of whom had gone through the logical-ish upgrade for their builds. His eagle let out a loud squawk overhead in agreement. Or, of course, you can try for something special. He pointed towards the constantly glowing Oak. The Indra beamed back at the party and made a flexing motion, looking ridiculous as he did. Right. Scar looked at his party, then at his screen, and then looked over at Oak once again. I'm going to have to go with the... Screw it, I'm going to gamble, No More called out, selecting an option on his screen. Everyone froze the moment he did and held their breaths. Once you chose your subclass, you couldn't undo your choice. Chapter 36. Probably best for the rest of us to choose a class that makes a bit of sense, Scar spoke as he selected his option, and the rest of his members nodded in agreement. No More had been successful in his gamble, but at what cost? Even now, Rue was still laughing hysterically. Most likely the best choice given the upcoming war. Z nodded in agreement and turned towards the Terminus's lair, where they could see a faint bit of light flickering in the darkness. That light was from the portal to James's third floor. Yeah, who knows what would happen otherwise? Troll strode past No More, bending down slightly to pat the gnome on the top hat. Wouldn't want to completely mess up how I had been building my character. The troll shot a smirk at No More and kept walking. Probably one of your worst decisions, man. Manley walked by the gnome, hefting both his axes high. And you made a lot of poor choices. No More had tried for a secret class, and to his credit, he had gotten a secret class. The new class was called an acupuncturist. James had no idea what it did. From what the gnome had mentioned, before going silent, mainly due to everyone's jokes, he had opted to try and make an even deadlier assassin. In doing so, he had chosen the alchemist subclass, hoping to create a class that specialized in stealth and alchemical dangerous potions, which James had to admit did sound cool. To be fair, the class was a special class still, and James knew from how Oak performed as an Indra and his own spiritualist class that they seemed to pack a punch. But no one had given No More much chance to explain his new skill sets. The name, and the fact it no longer seemed very assassin-like, had led to tons of jokes. Assassin sounded dark and cool. Acupuncturist, other than being overpriced, sounded more like a healer than a damage dealer. Given the upcoming war and the very real chance if they did unlock special classes, their tactics and playstyles might have to change, everyone else had decided to stick with the known, at least this time around. It was easier, after all, than trying to suddenly learn a completely different style of play. As such, the raid party, having leveled up and looted the boss, moved into the Terminus's lair, excited for their next new adventure, and with only one new Oops class unlocked. James scanned over the members as they moved forward, making mental notes of their class options. Trold had chosen to become a monster hunter, which was exactly what it sounded like. An advanced class option that specialized in hunting and taking down large prey, meaning his DPS had not only increased, but he also gained trap abilities. Olivia had become a high cleric of the light, just like Medic. Manly the dwarf had moved on from being an axe duelist to an axe champion. James knew from reading over class details that the axe champion became even more skilled in the use of axes and also gained a few unique skills to augment his damage. It also allowed him to summon a third, magical axe, which would fight alongside him. This only stood out in James's mind because he heard Manly mention he was going to name the magical axe Frank for some reason. Finally, there was Scar. The orc leader of the Boss Slayers Guild had chosen to upgrade himself from being a Death Knight to a Dread Knight. That class had all the defensive traits of the Death Knight, but added in a few new tricks. The first was that Dread Knights could make themselves completely invulnerable by going ethereal, for a few moments at least. They also had a new siphon ability to use, as well as a passive aura that actually impacted any foes around the Dread Knight. It was the perfect class for the tank of the guild. "What's the plan, Z?" Scar asked as everyone gathered around the portal. While both Scar and Z were guild leaders, everyone usually deferred decisions to Z. It was simple to see why. Z gave off an aura. He made everyone around him feel better. He put them all at ease. At the same time, it was obvious he knew what he was doing, and he always remained calm. That made him the perfect leader in the group's eyes. "The plan," Z held a hand up to his chin, "is to make a plan." He grinned as he spoke, drawing groans from all 9 adventurers standing around him. "That's not a plan," Manly coughed. Z flashed him a smile and just shrugged towards the portal. "We've got an entire day's worth of diving before the war starts. The biggest hurdle was getting you guys to level 30, which we've accomplished." He looked at his pets, his smile widening even more. His eagle, which he had named Turk, was holding Badgie between its massive talons. "How about we just run in there and see what happens?" As he spoke, he nodded towards Turk, and the eagle flew through the portal. "Then when we come back, we can have an actual plan." He started to step towards the portal, smile widening even more. "Might as well have some fun, after all, before we start this war." After he finished speaking, his form disappeared, and he reappeared on a different screen for James to monitor. The very first third-floor instance for his dungeon. James couldn't help but smile. It was a big moment, and he was really glad it was Z's and Scar's parties that were going to give his third floor its first run-through. Granted, given Z's plan, he was also excited about the experience he was about to gain. "I swear, sometimes I cannot believe you guys are the top-ranked guild," Scar groaned as he shook his head, looking at the portal even as Oak began walking through. The Indra gave Scar a grin and disappeared. Immediately after him, Faust's form disappeared, and then Elm's. All that was left was Scar's guild and Medic. The healer looked at them all and motioned towards the portal. "It is things like this that make us the top-ranked guild." He walked closer to the portal, turning his back on them as he did. "Life, whether it be in a game or in real life, is too short not to enjoy, after all." Those words lingered as he stepped through the portal, joining his guildmates in the new instance. It was a good thing, too, considering as James glanced at his new instance, he could see things were already getting interesting. He may have, after all, adjusted his mob layout just a bit. He didn't like that players had so much free time unthreatened by mobs when they spawned into his second floor. He has a point. Troll smiled, the two tusks sprouting from his mouth lifting wide. He unslung his bow and grabbed Olivia around the waist. Without warning, he threw the cleric, his girlfriend, through the portal and followed after. Scar simply let out a sigh and motioned for the rest of his members to follow. As James had seen many times before, everyone seemed to follow Z and the Knights Who Go Knee. Chapter 37. Chaos had ensued the moment Z and his party had begun to arrive on the third floor. That was because, while all of his mobs except for the boss were set to roam, he had made a special exception for one set of mobs. These mobs spawned directly over the portal of the third floor and were tasked with defending it and an area of about 50 feet around it. That meant any time adventurers came through the portal, they were in for a surprise. The mobs he was watching currently having a lot of fun with the underprepared adventurers were, of course, Jolly Dollies. 5 of the adorably terrifying dollies were up in the trees, running along their platforms, laughing in high-pitched, childlike voices. When Z had entered the dungeon, 2 of them had actually managed to lasso their pull strings around his arms, ensnaring him and lifting him completely off of the wooden platforms of the swamp and into the air, pulling him closer to them. That was, of course, accompanied by them whispering terrifyingly,
"Come play with us."
James had figured he was about to get some easy experience right then and there, as their attack had left Z completely defenseless. But luckily for the adventurer, it seemed Turk was in a good mood. The eagle, who had been circling around the area with Badgie in tow, had let out a loud screech when he saw Z tangled and caught, and had swiftly flown higher into the sky. The dense trees meant the eagle couldn't make much use of its flying abilities, but he was able to get high enough to drop Badgie onto the wooden pathway that the dollies were standing on. In that moment, James got to watch a bunch of animated dolls running about, giggling as they were chased by a snarling badger. That decision by Turk had given Z enough time to break free from his binds, and he was able to regain his composure by the time Oak entered the third floor. As the rest of the knights came through the portal, the scene on James's third floor simply continued to grow even more ridiculous. Badgie, to his credit, had been doing all he could against the dollies. However, one of them had managed to get the pull portion of their string around the poor beast's neck and was now riding atop him while laughing maniacally. 2 others were constantly throwing their makeshift lassos towards Turk, who, as a result, was unable to get closer to attack. The 2 remaining Jolly Dollies were simply scampering about and laughing eerily. Every time Z and Elm tried to shoot them, they would simply duck behind a tree branch or into one of the little huts James had made for them.
Man, no one said we would be freaking fighting dolls. I shall have nightmares from Annabelle.
Oak had his shield up and was watching the bridges above him. The group had moved a few feet away from the portal to allow more room for Scar's party to join, and as such, were now getting onto the narrower, more rickety portions of the walkway James had created.
It could have been worse.
Z was laughing as he launched another arrow.
We're in a swamp. What terrible things usually live in swamps, buddy?
His laughter faded as a sudden enraged scream from Turk made him wince. James knew Z had a way to track his pet's health, and currently it wasn't looking good for them.
Don't even wish that evil upon me, Ricky Bobby.
Oak moved further away from the portal on the bridge, his eyes still watching above.
You know Anaconda left me with a terrible phobia.
Oh, really? James whispered aloud, and his comment drew a string of giggles from Rue. The 2 of them had moved to the instance Z and his party were currently in, as they hovered invisibly high above, watching everything play out. The pixie, he noticed, was currently eating what he was certain were Dickin' nuggets. His suspicion was confirmed when he saw the bucket in front of her, with DS emblazoned on the side. She was eating Dickin' nuggets from the Dickin' shack. How had she even gotten those? You, going to share? He was curious just how the Dickin' shack food tasted, and was really curious if they tasted just like chicken. It was rare to get anything fried nowadays, which was why such cooking was still extremely popular in immersion. As such, James suddenly found he had an extreme longing for some fried Dickon. Not to mention, he knew the owners of the Dickon Shack in the game were actual chefs in the real world. They'd apparently been working on their cooking skills in-game to set up their restaurant chain. That, of course, and the super popular Fireball whiskey made from demonic corn.
If you had a way to eat it, sure.
She grabbed another nugget, grinning.
But since you don't,
She popped it into her mouth, letting out an exaggerated moan.
I'll just keep enjoying my golden nuggies for both of us.
I hate you, he grumbled back, before turning back to his task at hand. The group, with the combined efforts of all three ranged classes and Faust, had managed to bring down 2 of the dollies, leaving just the 3 that were harassing Z's pets. They may have won the battle, but James still had the entire war to throw their way. With a chuckle, he selected the closest mob that fit what he was looking for and gave it a simple command. One of the joys he had found in being a dungeon core within DCO was that he could manually command his mobs in instances. He may have abused that ability once or twice before, such as when he swarmed Dwight's group with a flock of Dickens and a mad cow, but more or less he rarely used it. Oak's revelation that he hated snakes, though, was just too much. Z, after all, had mentioned he wanted to have fun with this dive into the 3rd floor before they came back later with a plan. Well, if Z and friends were going to have fun, James was too. After all, this was a great moment to try and relax and enjoy one of the finer points of being a dungeon core in DCO. That point being the constant and often hilarious interactions of adventurers and his crazy mobs. As he watched the raid party finally bring down the remaining 3 jolly dollies, earning a cheer and more than a few confused looks from the members as they looted the mobs, James couldn't help but smile. With his overhead view of the floor, he could see deep into the swamp around the party. And what he saw was more than a little exciting. When he had decided to select his mob, he had been specifically looking for a giant plaython. After all, he had 5 giant playthons roaming around on his floor, and he had wanted to simply have one appear and attack Oak. It would have been one level 34 mob versus a 10-man group. It wouldn't have been much. However, the closest giant plaython to the entrance wasn't a loner. Instead, it was one of his packs that he had devised. And, well, he couldn't very well just give the plaython an order to go alone. Instead, the entire group of mobs had made their way rapidly towards the portal entrance. Because of that, just as the party finished looting the Jolly Dollies and began to regroup, a commotion caused them all to freeze, partially due to the sudden movement that was immediately noticeable in the swamp. The other reason being that there was suddenly a loud, haunting, terrified scream coming from somewhere in the darkness. Now, the first real encounter begins, James said, watching in excitement as a giant plaython with a mounted knight on its back rushed towards the party. In the air, a funky monkey flew towards them, screeching its obnoxious cry. Further in the back, running as fast as his fluffy legs could carry him, a lone light knight made its way toward the party as well. This was going to be the first of many awesome fights for this dive. He could just feel it. Chapter 38. Oak hadn't been kidding about being terrified of snakes. The mighty Indra, meant to be the stalwart, indomitable tank for the knights who go knee, had screamed like a girl and jumped probably 10 feet in the air when the giant plaython came into view, which, had it not been for the quick thinking of the rest of the raid party, would have been the end for their 3rd floor escapades. Luckily for everyone involved, they weren't complete noobs and knew how to react in most situations. Besides, if there was one thing James had come to appreciate about these 2 guilds, it was how quickly they could adapt. That, and they were getting used to the ridiculousness that was James's dungeon. As such, the moment the giant plaython came into view, Teddy Knight riding on its back, the party had looked to Oak to intercept. When he was deemed incapacitated, Scar took the lead, placing himself in the path of the rapidly approaching stuffed foes. At the same time, both clerics, uncertain of what the new foes would bring, began casting a variety of buff spells. Medic even cast a cleanse spell, as the veteran healer had noticed the funky monkey's cry had stunned 2 other party members. He gave Medic credit for that, but seemed he was actively monitoring his teammates' stats, even with the world erupting in crazy chaos around him. When the mobs and parties clashed, it was a battle of hilariously epic proportions. Honestly, it was a fight that James hadn't been sure how he would feel about. But watching it take place, he was really glad he had these new mobs. Especially because with the creepy atmosphere set by the swamp, it just played into an even more horror-esque battle. The first enemies to reach the party were the giant Plaython and the mounted Teddy Knight. As Scar had stepped up to face the new enemies, his entire form had begun to glow darkly, and James watched as Scar promptly activated one of his brand new Dread Knight skills. Dark energy, accompanied by a dreadful wail, flowed off of him and crashed into the giant Plaython and Teddy Knight. The skill was called Dread Wail, and it had a 50% chance to cause 5 seconds of fear on enemies. With a flip of the coin on his skill, James was curious what exactly would happen. To his utter amusement, the result was pure comedy. The fear, it seemed, managed to affect the giant Plaython, but not the Teddy Knight. However, that didn't really matter, because just as horses did in movies, the giant Plaython immediately stopped its sudden approach and reared back, letting out a massive hiss in Scar's direction, which elicited another scream of terror from Oak as he tried to regain his composure. Now, unlike the movies, the brave Teddy Knight didn't manage to hold on. Of course, how could he? When a 20-foot snake stops at full momentum, it probably creates a bit more force than a horse stopping. The end result, then, was the Teddy Knight being sent flying over the giant Plaython, essentially launching himself, lance and all, towards the raid party. To the group's credit, almost everyone got away from the flying projectile that was the Teddy Knight. Well, everyone who wanted to get away did. Trold, Faust, and Elm had spread out and began launching their attacks at the stopped giant Plaython, knowing full well when the fear faded, it was likely going to present a huge problem. Z was on the lookout for the approaching flying monkey, his eyes locked onto its form as it rapidly approached, while Turk was carrying Badgie overhead, likely looking for an enemy to drop the Badger on. That left Manly and No More, the two melee members of the group, with nothing to do, until they noticed a flying Teddy Knight coming straight towards the party. The two looked at each other, grinned, and prepared themselves. The poor Teddy Knight didn't stand a chance. James watched in surprise and awe as No More's hands glowed for a moment, and 2 thin needles appeared in his hands. With all the accuracy and ease expected of an assassin, No More threw the glowing needles at the approaching bear mob. The needles flew true and sunk within about 3 inches of each other into the Teddy Knight's right shoulder. The needles glowed for a brief second, and then James watched as, curiously, the Teddy Knight's lance fell from his grasp and his arm went completely limp. What in the world? James glanced at Rue, who was watching the entire fight unfold before them, her food left forgotten on the table floating in front of her. She shrugged and turned back to the fight, and he sighed and did the same. They would be chatting more about No More a little later, but the fight, as it unfolded, needed their full attention. With the lance dropped from the Teddy Knight, it no longer had a pointy weapon with which to attack. As such, it switched tactics, using its shield to create a wall between itself and the ground, so that when it landed on the wooden bridge, the shield absorbed the impact, and the bear, impressively, flipped back up to its feet.
Think I should ask him for directions?
Manly the dwarf called out to No More as he rushed the bear, his glowing third axe floating alongside him. The mob raised its shield and turned to intercept the dwarf, but a split second later dropped that piece of defense as well. 2 more needles were sticking out of its left shoulder, and that arm too went limp.
I thought we should get straight to the point.
No More stuck his tongue out at Manly and started laughing, 2 more needles in his hand.
You're such a prick,
Manly responded, even as he swung all of his axes at the defenseless Teddy Knight. The 2 in his hands glowed brightly, and James knew they were about to do a lot more damage than normal. As an axe champion, Manly the dwarf now had access to a unique passive that added 10% true damage to all of his axe attacks. On top of that, if he was using an axe, he got an additional 50 damage to each axe per level in his axe champion class. Meaning if those axes connected, the bear was in for a world of hurt. Needless to say, the poor knight, with 2 useless arms, having been flung unceremoniously off of its trusted mount, did not have a way to defend himself. Manly's axes both cut deeply into the poor bear, ripping fluffing, as James had dubbed it, out as the axes tore through its cloth-stitched armor. Even more unfortunate for the poor mob was that both those axes did slashing damage, meaning each of Manly's already enhanced attacks were doing an additional 10% damage to the poor bear. All in all, the night didn't last long. Of course, one night down didn't mean the fight was over for the rest of the party. Oh no, not by a long shot. Because even as they finished the single Teddy night and turned to focus on the giant Plaython, whose fear had now faded, reinforcements were already on their way. Not only was the Funky Monkey in range to utilize more of its skills, the Light Knight was finally near enough to the giant Plaython to begin buffing it with its Teddy Paladin magic. And on top of that, James had ordered one more set of mobs to aid the group attacking the raid party. If the Knights and Boss Slayers were going to create a 10-man raid party to explore his third floor, well, it only made sense for James to increase the number of mobs being thrown at them at any given time. Besides, he was really enjoying the brutal carnage as stitching was torn and stuffing was being flung about. Especially because it seemed the fluffing, which was soaked with swamp water, was starting to actually impede the adventurers' movement as it stuck to them and mucked up the area around them with soggy debris. Huzzah for accidental debuffs. Chapter 39. With the reinforcements joining the fray, the fight took the raid party a good 10 to 15 minutes to actually clear. James had been pleased to see the Light Knight did a great job at supporting the giant Plaython, giving it a buff that actually made a glowing needle appear around the Plaython, stitching its wounds shut as soon as it received them. Meanwhile, the Funky Monkey had attempted to buff the Plaython as well, doing its best to give the snake a speed buff with Get Funky. However, it seemed Turk the Eagle was having none of that, and so Z's pet dropped a badger on the monkey's drum session, which led to the monkey going slap-happy as it attacked both Turk and Badgie. The group of mobs James had sent as support had been a mounted knight on a Snugglewolf with a Light Knight in tow. As much as James had wanted to send in the cavalry with the group that had 3 Snugglewolfs, 3 mounted knights, a Light Knight, and a Funky Monkey, that group of mobs had sadly been too far away. Regardless, just as the raid party had gotten the giant Plaython down to about half life, the reinforcements had arrived, adding more chaos to the mix. The Snugglewolf and mounted knight had blasted through the side, catching Trold and Faust completely by surprise. Meanwhile, the additional Light Knight added its own healing abilities to the giant Plaython. The mobs obviously knew that massive snake was their path to victory, and they were doing all they could to keep it alive. The turning point in the fight had been when the giant Plaython had gotten close enough to Oak to use its struggle snuggles on the immobilized, terrified Indra. The snake's massive, soaking wet form had wrapped tightly around Oak, even as the others did their best to burn down its HP. As it constricted the Indra, James had been able to see Oak's eyes go white with sheer terror, as swamp waterlogged, soggy patchwork wrapped around him and began to tighten. The giant Plaython, James was sure, had thought it had just snagged an easy target. However, apparently the stuffed snake had never heard what people said about cornered animals being the most dangerous. In a moment of sheer terror and panic, Oak unleashed everything. And James meant that literally. The Indra utilized all of his cooldowns and blew all of his skills in a single instance. Normally, people didn't even do that during boss fights, so when the level 32 Indra did that against the level 33 mob, well, it turned the tide in an instant. What James had learned from the first time Oak had faced off against the Terminus as an Indra was that the class had given him a cooldown that differed greatly from his other ones. Sure, Oak still had his massive damage reduction cooldown, which greatly decreased the amount of damage he took. However, the Indra cooldown was an explosive eruption of energy that transformed Oak from an elf into an 8-foot-tall being of electricity, which grew 2 additional arms. These 2 arms each held a curved dagger made of energy, and they were brutal. So immediately after Oak's form disappeared within the soggy and likely smelly patches of cloth and stuffing that was the giant Plaython, he immediately reappeared in his Super Saiyan form, as he called it. The electrically charged, glowing energy form of Oak had let out a scream of both terror and rage, and began wailing on the giant Plaython, even as the mob did its best to try and tighten its hold on it. Of course, Because Oak had blown all of his cooldowns, he was taking 50% less damage, and as the shielder cooldown dictated, his regular attacks were doing 90% less damage. Oak didn't care though, because in his Super Saiyan form, his energy daggers didn't do regular damage. In fact, they didn't actually take any of his stats into consideration when he attacked. Instead, the energy daggers drained 0.5% of the enemy's maximum HP per strike. And from what James had observed, Oak was able to get about 20 hits in with his daggers while he was in the glowing cooldown form, as it lasted for only 30 seconds, meaning that with both cooldowns active at the same time, he was taking 50% less damage, dealing 10% of the enemy's life in damage, and healing for that amount as well. It was a bit broken. Of course, the Endra form had a 15-minute cooldown, compared to the 10-minute cooldown for his shielder ability, so there was a reason for that. From there, the group had rallied around Oak's sudden action and used that moment to overwhelm the giant Plaython. Even while the mob had 2100 maximum HP and 650 fluff, it had already been at half its fluff and about half its life when it had attacked Oak. So when all of a sudden Oak took another 10% of its life from it, and it had 3 archers, an axe champion, a mage, and a gnome with daggers turning on it too, well, it didn't stand a chance. Of course, the raid party had managed such a burst because Scar had been holding off the Snugglewolf and Mounted Knight thanks to the combined healing given to him from Met-Ik and Olivia. Long story short, James needed to throw more mobs at them next time. "This floor is ridiculous," Troll said as the group made their way down the creaking wooden path that James had created, finally moving further into the floor after that battle.
"I don't know, man. I kinda like it."
Elm looked back at the troll and shot him a wink, motioning towards Oak, who was walking shakily in the middle of the party. Scar had taken the lead as tank, as Oak still needed some time to recover, apparently. From what James had heard Z and the others say, this wasn't the first time Oak had broken down when he encountered snakes in a game, but they assured everyone that he always eventually came to terms with. The initial shock was always the worst for him, they claimed.
"It's not often we get him to shut up."
Elm's comment earned him a nasty look from a pale Oak.
"Heck, with a phobia like his, maybe he should put on a snake costume and call himself Snake Man."
That produced a bit of laughter from the party.
I hate you,
Oak grumbled, but it was hard for anyone to take him seriously, as he was constantly scanning the entire area for more giant Playthons and jumping at every sound from the swamp. The laughter continued, and James couldn't help but feel the tension leaving him. Not all of it, of course, but this was what he needed to settle his mind before the dungeon wars. And even better, his therapy wasn't even done yet. Oh no, this show was just getting started. Chapter 40.
Anyone know who the hell Yarks is?
Z asked. The party, after a few more skirmishes and another tryst with some jolly dollies, had finally made it to the shrine to Yarks. Of course, it was sunken into the mud and not exactly the most accessible, though James had made it possible to get to should the adventurers want to. As such, they were all standing around the circle that led to the shrine, eyeing it suspiciously. James wasn't 100% sure how such objects appeared to the players, but if it was similar to other MMOs he had played in Immersion, the name for the shrine likely hung overhead for them. Granted, that was all that it would show, and they would actually have to present an offering to the shrine in order to see what the buff was that it gave them. And, unlike Rue's shrine, this one didn't have any mention or even a poem regarding what it did.
"He is the all-seeing god and sits at the top of the pantheon for deities in TCO."
Everyone, including James, paused at the response. It didn't come from Z or Scar or any of the more serious players. In fact, it came from Manly the Dwarf, literally the last person James would have expected to care about lore, other than maybe Troll. Thanks? Z, just like everyone else standing around the statue, seemed more than a little surprised. After all, no one would expect a player named Manly the Dwarf to actually care about lore in an MMO. James had figured he was the type of player that just wanted to run around killing things with an axe, which he did do quite well. "No problem," Manly added as he pulled out a flask. Engraved on the side of it was a hammer and anvil, the symbol of the dwarven deity of battle, Brolab. Alright, so maybe Manly was more than just a little into lore.
When did you become a lore hound?
Trold bent over to nudge the dwarf, who simply took a long swig from his flask before calmly putting it away.
I got drunk to the point my character passed out during the first 24 hours of DCO, so because he was technically incapacitated, I had a lot of time to waste. I figured I would check out the dwarven deities and then just kinda got dragged into it. There's pretty much a deity for everything.
Manly shrugged, while everyone else just stared hard at him. While you could get yourself drunk in DCO, if for some reason whatever you had done to yourself in a game resulted in you falling unconscious, you were returned to your starting screen for immersion. You would be unable to relog into your character until it had finally regained consciousness, but you could still access data logs, appendices, and the like. Or if you felt like wasting time, you could force sleep yourself for 8 hours, or even leave the game and head back to the zone. Of course, you couldn't escape all the downsides of your actions. Usually, games would include a hangover debuff when you did return to consciousness in-game. Some made that debuff so brutal that clerics would hang out around taverns in MMOs. They could make some quick coin offering to cure hangovers. Maybe we should check out the deities a little later on. Z looked at his members, who all shrugged. While they were definitely veteran MMO players, they likely viewed the Pantheon as just neat background information. And while it was interesting, it didn't have any direct tie-ins to the game yet, from what James could tell, meaning players were less likely to actually care about it.
Seems like a lot of work,
Oak grumbled, glancing around at the different paths that led away from the shrine.
Where do you think these other paths lead?
He was, of course, referring to the 7 paths that led away from the shrine. The 6 paths to the swag shacks, and the one to Rue's shrine. James was really hoping they would go investigate all of those. So far, they hadn't stopped at any of the outhouses, which had been disappointing. There were a total of 3 mimics on his 3rd floor, spread across 17 different swag shacks. The outhouses that weren't mimics actually acted as treasure chests, so they were missing out. Of course, one of the 6 outhouses that circled around the shrine was actually a mimic, a level 75 one at that, and James really wanted some experience.
Why don't you go look? If you were brave enough to go it alone.
No more grinned at Oak as the Indra shot him an angry look.
Of course, you might want to watch out for snakes.
How about we check out this shrine, and then go check them all out together?
Z was already walking towards the shrine of Yarks as he spoke, his eyes glancing around the area.
What do you think the chances are it's trapped?
Badgie was sniffing at the planks, the trap-finding badger obviously worried. However, while it most definitely was trapped, James wasn't sure if the badger could sniff it out, given he'd layered it under the water.
Would be pretty blasphemous, Manly said with another drink. Trapping the shrine of the top deity?
True. Z looked at Badgie, and the badger let out a confused sound. Badgie wasn't sure if it was trapped or just stunk like the rest of the swamp. After a moment, the Beastmaster let out a deep breath.
YOLO, he said aloud,
and he boldly strode towards the shrine.
YOLO?
James asked Rue, as Z made his way closer to the shrine.
It stands for you only live once,
She responded, her eyes practically sparkling with anticipation and glee. She knew, just as he did, what was about to happen. Oh, well, that's fitting, he chuckled, just as Z reached the end of the path. Call him blasphemous, but of course he was going to trap the shrine, even if Xander wasn't a dick. The buffs it gave were too good to just let players snag easily. And that meant Z had just put himself in line for one of James's newest traps.
Should have prayed to the goddess of luck first,
James whispered as the trap sprang to life. It was actually a multi-part trap meant to essentially guarantee at least one player was killed each time they approached the shrine until they figured out it was trapped. The first part of the trap to spring was that when the adventurer neared the end of the path, the planks they were standing on would drop away, causing the player to drop quickly into the murky swamp waters. Instead of solid ground under the water, there was quicksand, which would swiftly begin pulling the adventurer down and under. At the same time, the circular path the players were standing on around the shrine would begin to creak and crack as well, with pieces of boards dropping and falling left and right all over, making the path even more treacherous. Then, as that chaos was breaking out, the shrine of Yarks would actually tip over, falling on top of the adventurer that was trapped in a quicksand. James knew adventurers would have a decent amount of life going into the third floor, but he figured a giant statue falling on their heads, coupled with a quicksand trap and drowning, would quickly equal death. He also found it poetic that the last thing they saw before they were turned into a glowing orb was Xander's face. It was a nice little way to make people secretly begin to hate Xander as much as James did. Huzzah for traps. As planned, the trap went off successfully, and Z suddenly went from the land of the living to the land of the floating orb. Of course, his own comment was only slightly ironic, as the party was able to regain their footing and Medic was able to perform a resurrection for Z before he was sent all the way back to the start of the zone. Unfortunately for Z, his death meant the shrine to Yarks had just cost him all of his experience, and he had been close to level 33. James felt slightly bad about that, given the fact that Dungeon Wars was right around the corner, but he figured he needed to make himself stronger as well. Besides, Z and his party were sure to continue grinding experience before the wars started in full swing. Achievement unlocked. Divine Judgment. Kill an adventurer utilizing a holy shrine. Reward, 5,000 XP, 1,000 resources, +1 upgrade to all shrines. Increases duration and effective rates of shrine boosts and buffs by 1% per shrine upgrade level. Praise Yarks, James jokingly exclaimed as he read the achievement, even as Z was cursing that same name below in the instance. Between Z's death experience and the achievement, James was now just under 10k experience from becoming a Tier 3 Rank 5 dungeon, which, given his normal daily rate of experience gain in Immersion, meant he was without a doubt going to hit Rank 6 before day 1 of the Dungeon War started. Meaning James was about to have a total of 5 extra skill points for all of his Tier 3 mobs. With those upgrades, and from what he knew of Blank's adventurers, thanks to their forums, they were not going to be able to steamroll his third floor. Not at all. Chapter 41. That buff was totally worth your death, Oak called out to Z as the party approached another one of the swag shacks that surrounded the Shrine of Yarts. Initially, Z had gone up to the shrine and offered it a copper coin, after he was revived, of course. With the gift of the copper coin, the shrine revealed to him all of the enemies within 100 feet of the players. The buff, James knew, lasted for at least 30 minutes per copper coin, though was a little longer thanks to the upgrade to the shrine he had just unlocked. From what Z said about the buff, it seemed the enemies showed up as red dots on the map the players had as part of their visual display. That part made sense to James, as most MMOs now utilized a visual display for players that usually showcased your health bar, magic bar, and level in the top left, with a mini-map on the top right. That map, depending on the game, showed terrain, quest points, and enemies. Considering they needed the buff from Yarks to show where the enemies were, James had to guess that the map for DCO just showed terrain. After Z donated his copper coin, the others convinced him to drop in a silver coin just to see what happened. When he did, his eyes had immediately grown larger. The Beastmaster made a motion, which James had gotten used to as the motion to pull up their virtual map. From there, Z seemed to excitedly scan it before he turned and grinned at the players. The silver coin, after all, revealed the location of traps and mimics to players, which was a bit of a letdown in James's eye. He had really been looking forward to a toilet mimic attack this dive. James's third floor mimics were level 75, and he really wanted to see what happened when a player tried to kill one of those bad boys. He was imagining a scene from an old, cheesy horror movie where the player just got sucked down into the toilet hole within the outhouse, never to be seen again. With the realization that the shrine gave different buffs depending on the coins spent, Z had immediately dropped in a gold coin, which unlocked the location of the treasure chests and hidden items on the floor within 100 feet of the players, which meant they had seen which of his swag shacks, as he likes to call them, was actually secretly a treasure chest. For his third floor, the outhouses either served as regular outhouses, treasure chests, or mimics. James was trying to shine a light on a crappy situation for players, after all. I suppose. Though next time, someone else has to front the platinum cost. Z looked directly at Oak, the message clear. The Indra had been the one to push Z into donating a platinum coin to the shrine, telling the guild leader that it was his duty to potentially unlock the best buff for his party. Of course, James knew Z would have done it for his group anyways. That was just the kind of guy Z was. But with Oak giving him a hard time, James also knew the Beastmaster was going to make his friend pay. Literally, next time. Definitely worth it. Oak laughed as he stepped up to the outhouse and opened it up. Sure enough, where normally a hole for a toilet space would have been, instead there was a slightly moldy, worn chest. Eagerly, Oak opened up the chest, and as he did, a slight glow came from within it. Chests in DCO worked much like they did in the other MMOs James had played. When they opened, they would emit a faint light, signaling to other players that there was a chest nearby. From within, each player that interacted with the chest could receive a number of items preset by James from the chest. For his treasure chests, James had decided to set their item drop chances based on rarity and difficulty. His first floor, being the easiest, had the chest only dropping a single item per person, ranging from a few gold pieces, considering what he had told Dwight, to a piece of set gear or a unique item. After all, as his loot research had increased, his ability to modify and adapt loot had also gone up. His second floor, being more difficult, had chests dropping up to 2 items per player, with a higher chance of gold and rarer items. Set gear, of course, was almost always the rarest item a chest could drop. There were also unique items from the floor that couldn't be found in chests. He had allowed some of the simpler mob pets to be potential chest drops, but boss and mini-boss mob pets were not. As Oak finished looking at his loot, and the others did the same, the Endra's facial expression immediately soured. He was not happy with what he had gotten.
So, anyone want to trade with me real quick?
His face was pale again, and he was looking frantically around the group.
Depends.
Manly was the first to respond, the axe champion leaning forward easily on one of his axes as he eyed Oak up and down.
What you got to trade?
Oak looked down at the dwarf, his mind likely racing. James was pretty sure he knew what Oak had gotten, but he couldn't confirm just yet. James knew exactly what types of items could be dropped in the chest, and there was only one thing he could think of that would cause Oak to act like this.
It's, a third-floor pet.
Yep, it was exactly what James thought it was.
I could do for a new pet.
Manly's eyes were gleaming as he waved a hand, pulling up his menu and selecting an option. A split second later, Oak made a similar motion, opening up his trade menu. He frowned for a moment as he looked at the screen, before he simply shook his head and hit another invisible button. By the smile on Manly's face, the trade had gone in the dwarf's favor, or at least in the dwarf's opinion it had.
Pleasure doing business with you.
Manly grinned as he went back into his options. A moment later, his pet, which had been a little triceracog, disappeared. In its place, a giant Plaython pet appeared. Well, giant wasn't actually the correct word, as it was only about 3 feet in length, much smaller than its 20-foot counterpart. However, it was a third-floor pet mob, meaning once it was trained properly, it was going to be stronger than Manly's triceracog had been. James also knew that many of the players had begun collecting and training up different pet mobs to swap out depending on the situation. The triceracog was a tanky pet mob, while the giant Plaython was an attack type.
Do you have to have him out right now?
Oak looked down with distaste at the pet mob as he slowly backed away from it.
Like, seriously? Mr. Snack needs to level up,
the dwarf replied as he turned back to Z. The guild leader of the knights was the only one who had offered up a coin to the shrine, after all, meaning he was currently leading them through the swamp.
Where to next, boss man?
As Manly spoke, the others all turned their eyes from their inventories back to Z. So far, other than the pet mob, James wasn't too sure what they had been getting from the chests. He knew the biggest reason for that was that they didn't want to ruin their set gear bonuses with any of the lesser gear options or items that could be in the chest. He was still waiting for them to begin getting some of the weapon and gear drops from the floor, though. He had really enjoyed messing with, designing some of those weapons. A perk he'd unlocked at his higher loot research level.
Well, I say we pick off some of the smaller mob groups and see if we can't get the knights a level before we head to the boss.
Z looked at his invisible map and offered the party a grin.
After all, might as well finish this dive with a heroic go at the boss.
Chapter 42. True to form, Z successfully led the knights from one roaming group of mobs to another. With the map from the shrine, he expertly led the raid party past all of the traps and managed to hit all of James's chests and hidden treasures along the way. Of course, the hidden treasures weren't something James had control over currently. The treasures themselves were an option he had unlocked when his loot and event research had reached level 6, but didn't have much ability to customize them yet. He hadn't really even had time to learn much about them, what with the whole dungeon wars and threat to existence on the line. However, he had found that he was now able to add in map pieces as drops for his mobs, and items that could be found in his treasure chest. These map pieces, when combined, would randomly generate a location on the map that would have a little hidden cache within it. Frustratingly, James wasn't able to modify the treasure they got from those just yet, meaning what adventurers found in those caches was currently dependent on DCO's predetermined loot table. It seemed that with the platinum-level donation to the Shrine of Yarks, the need for those treasure maps was eliminated. In its stead, Z apparently was able to spot where the caches were and led the group to a few that were close enough to not waste too much time. To James and Rue's amusement, none of the hidden treasures the groups had found were in desirable places, with 2 being hidden in the middle of the swamp, requiring the adventurers to leave the wooden path and wade through gaseous swamp water. The third was actually under one of the massive trees in its root system. That one had required no more to actually swim underneath the swampy water into what appeared suddenly to be a hollowed-out hovel of sorts. Within was the treasure the party had sought. The hidden loot system definitely seemed like a good incentive for players, especially if they didn't have the ability from Yarks eliminating the need for the map pieces. Without that buff, players would have to kill off dozens, if not hundreds of mobs in order to collect all the treasure pieces and find the loot. This meant it wouldn't be something they could farm on every dive into the dungeon, but something that would build up over time. James could also already see that mechanic being used by groups to form treasure raiding parties. Groups that just consisted of a lot of people with completed maps running around to find all of their respective treasures. Treasure trains, these were called, and James knew a lot of people who had hopped on those in past games, mainly because those were the events that often led to unique and epic-leveled items. Currently, James was only a Tier 3 dungeon, so he wasn't quite sure what the highest rarity of these items could be. He knew that as he unlocked more loot options in research, he was able to modify and create even better loot options. James also knew, from talking with Rue, that he was potentially able to create unique, legendary-leveled loot at lower levels. Of course, players would outlevel such loot in a short amount of time, which was why he hadn't decided to create any just yet. However, he was sure once his players' growth started to slow down, he would start dropping more powerful gear that they could utilize for a longer time within immersion. After all, one of his biggest pet peeves in games had been finding extremely powerful low-level gear that he wanted to use for a long time as he leveled. The result was usually leaving on the gear, even though it dropped his stats and actually may have slightly hurt him while he leveled, just because the bonus or skill it offered was too unique or cool to pass up. So far, though, there was a single thing that James was grateful for about the Shrine of Yarks' buff. It only lasted for 30 minutes, meaning Z and the party couldn't spend their entire 3 hours running around and abusing the extremely useful map reveal from the buff. Not to mention, the chests didn't respawn, meaning once they'd hit them, there wasn't a reason to head back to the shrine. Z seems to have realized this fact as well, as the guild leader had been slowly and steadily moving the party deeper into the swamp, drawing ever closer to the home of the third floor's mysterious and awesome boss. "How much time do they have left?" James asked Rue, as he watched the party engage another group of mobs in battle. This time, the group was his 4-mob pack of Snugglewolves. It was actually the first time the Knights and Slayers had come across a full pack of Snugglewolves, and James could tell right away the party wasn't as prepared for those mobs as they thought they had been. They were much too relaxed. Z seemed to think this would be an easy fight, after the group had dealt with the last lone Snugglewolf so easily. The party wasn't even in a proper battle formation, as they clearly considered this pack to be a non-threat. James knew this was far from the truth. The wolves they'd encountered before hadn't been buffed, but they didn't yet know this was possible.
About 4 minutes left.
Rue had started a timer the moment Z had begun dropping coins into the Shrine of Yarks, as they both knew the duration of the buff. This way, they would be able to tell when the buff dropped, and when the party would once again be roaming blind. After all, the moment their all-seeing buff was dropped, James could start sending mobs towards the group without drawing suspicion. Apparently he hadn't been, because he figured Z would find it a bit odd if all of a sudden the mobs on the map began moving towards him and his friends.
So, just this pack, and then they will probably move towards the boss?
Knowing how skilled Z and his friends were, James guessed the leader of the Knights Who Go Knee had already marked Grandma Jenkins' location on his map, so that even when the buff dropped, he would still know where to go. That was the benefit of having a stationary boss location, after all. You didn't have to worry about it moving. James was curious what Z had thought when he had seen the location of the boss and noticed there wasn't a roaming mini-boss on the level. This was, after all, the first floor James had that didn't have a roaming boss of some sort. Variety was the spice of life, and James's dungeon had plenty of that.
If they make it.
Rue motioned back towards the party, a smirk on her face. Sure enough, it seemed the party had finally met their match in mobs. The Snugglewolves weren't the strongest mobs on the floor, but they were the main self-buffing mobs for the third floor. That meant, in a pack, they instantly became the most dangerous of his mobs. Not only that, but the Snugglewolves were much more agile than the party had expected. Snugglewolf, level 33. Type, furry. HP, 2,550. 1,700 plus 950. 690, 460 plus 230 out of 690 fluff. MP, 1,725. 1,150 plus 575. Attack, 368. 245 plus 123. Defense, 270. 180 plus 90. Unique abilities. Alpha and Omega. A pack needs a leader. When Snugglewolves are in a pack of 4 or more, one of them becomes an Alpha Snugglewolf. The stats of the Alpha get doubled and increased by an additional 5% every time one of the other pack members is slain. The final Snugglewolf is the Omega. This Snugglewolf gets a sharp spike in its defense and will attempt to flee. If it is able to escape from its foes, it will heal and take on the mantle of Alpha, at which point it will return to try and avenge its fallen pack. Call of the Wild. Snugglewolves can let out a piercing howl, which has a 30% chance to decrease an enemy's defense by 25% for 30 seconds. This debuff has an increased chance to hit as more Snugglewolves join in. If 4 or more Snugglewolves utilize Call of the Wild, all enemies within 50 feet will have their defense decreased by 30% for 1 minute. Tactics. Snugglewolves in a pack are stronger than when they are alone. As a pack, regular Snugglewolves gain a 50% increase to all of their stats. If the Snugglewolf started in a pack and they lose a member, this increase is decreased by 10% per wolf eliminated. Unique traits. Stuffed with fluff. Stuffed animals are made out of, well, stuffing. As such, they receive 40% less damage from magical attacks, 30% less damage from blunt attacks, 20% more damage from piercing attacks, 10% more damage from slashing attacks. Cutting a stuffed animal open will result in it losing additional stuffing, decreasing the effects of stuffed with fluff based on the amount of fluff that has been lost. Lost fluff will reduce maximum HP of mobs by 5% per 10% of maximum fluff lost.
If they make it. Packs are tough, sure, but I mean...
James trailed off as the Alpha of the pack cocked its head back to let out a howl. The Alpha was easily discernible from the others, as not only was it larger than the rest of the pack, but it had a glowing, almost flame-like aura around itself. James was reminded of anime, in which the main characters had so much power it appeared as a visible aura around them. That was exactly what the Alpha Snugglewolf seemed to be doing. It also had a horn on its head, which James was slightly confused about, but figured it was a design option the developers had put in, so he wasn't going to question it. He figured it would play into the Snugglewolf's later abilities. He had noticed there were some unique upgrade options for those mobs further down their skill tree. As one, the other 3 Snugglewolves leaned back on their haunches and let out an eerie, mournful howl. Visible waves of energy rolled off of the beasts and onto the raid party. The adventurers looked around, their faces showing uncertainty, and a few of the party members actually stepped further away from the wolves. Even as Medic began to glow, preparing a mass debuff removal spell, the Snugglewolves turned, and the nearest one leapt towards him. Swamp water and mud flew through the air as the Snugglewolf's body freed itself from the swamp, and the massive beast crashed down on the poor cleric. With the increased attack ability and the debuff applied to Medic, he didn't stand a chance. The rest of the party stared, stunned at what had taken place. These Snugglewolves, with their pack buff, were much more potent than the singular ones they'd faced earlier. Z had made an error in underestimating them. Chapter 43.
Well, now they're really screwed.
Rue said, as the experience points rolled in. The group had managed to finally defeat the Snugglewolves, though it had cost them not only most of their cooldowns, but also a few consumables. On top of that, only 2 of the knights had actually survived the encounter. The survivors leveled up, and those that had fallen had fed James instead. Grinning, he glanced for a moment at his character information. Rank 5 had finally arrived. He was halfway to Tier 4. Glyax, Tier 3, Rank 5 Dungeon. Mob type, Random. 420,069 XP. 29,931 XP to next rank. 179,931 to next tier. Resources, 1,386 of 4,900. Currency, 89 copper, 17 silver, 11 gold, 0 platinum. Dungeon tokens, 20. His level up, thanks to the deaths of Z's party members, meant that his mobs had once again leveled as well. This meant all of his base mobs on his 3rd floor were now level 34. The worst part for the adventurers was that the boss mob, whom they still intended to face, had leveled as well. A quick glance confirmed James's fears. Grandma Jenkins was now level 44, and her pets were each level 39. If before it had been impossible for the raid party to defeat the boss, now it was laughable. All James could hope for out of the fight was that everyone at least survived a single round. After all, he wanted to see some of Grandma Jenkins' mechanics. He wanted to see what his 3rd floor boss was capable of. Currently, all of the boss slayers were level 30, though 4 of them had fallen in the fight against the Snugglewolves, meaning they had lost all the experience they had gained since coming to the 3rd floor. Of the knights, only Elm and Oak had survived the Snugglewolves, which had allowed both of those members to level up to level 33. Z, Faust, and Medic now had to start their experience gain over towards that level. It was a slight blow, but still one that James knew the parties would be able to overcome. After all, they still had at least 3 more dives into the dungeon for the day before the dungeon wars would start. This setback wasn't too much of a drawback for anyone, and the experience gain had been important for James. Now he had 4 skill points to apply to his mobs once they drew closer to the start of the war. James was also pretty sure he would be hitting rank 6 before the war started, considering how hard the players seemed to be going at his dungeon that day. Already he had hit max instances, and players were still lining up to eagerly dive into his dungeon. It seemed they were all doing the best they could to prepare themselves for the dungeon war.
Yup, definitely screwed. I mean, they don't have a thread of hope against your boss now.
Rue raised an eyebrow towards James and grinned. All he could do was groan in response. "That's not the point," James responded with a chuckle of his own. The adventurers were currently stalling to let their cooldowns refresh. A good tactic for any boss fight.
You reap what you sow.
Rue stuck her tongue out at him and motioned towards the party. There had been one other additional outcome to the last fight that at least had Z in good spirits. The Beastmaster had gotten a unique drop from the Alpha Snugglewolf, one which James hadn't even known was an option. He really needed to get back to his loot research. A miniature Alpha Snugglewolf now trotted at Z's side. That made 2 of the 10 members now with 3rd floor pets, though the Alpha Snugglewolf was without a doubt the better of the 2. He was the size of an actual dog, maybe standing about 3 feet high if you measured to his ears. Z had promptly given him the name Dogger, and then started talking to him in a cutesy manner, bragging about how good of a boy his doggo was. It was obvious that a few of the other members of the raid party were jealous of his mob drop. James could already foresee what the favorite pet drop was going to be for his 3rd floor.
What do you think the boss is going to be?
Olivia asked, as the group paused shortly after resuming their walk. They were in line of sight now of Grandma Jenkins' home. James had actually been really surprised by Olivia during the last fight. She'd saved them from a possible party wipe. She had good instincts and played her healer role well.
Please tell me it isn't her.
Faust pointed towards the front of the house where Grandma Jenkins sat, quietly knitting what appeared to be a scarf as she rocked gently in a large wooden rocking chair.
I'm pretty sure this is the right location.
Z made the motions indicating he was once again checking his map before looking at the shack.
The boss was definitely listed as being here.
So we have to fight an old innocent grandma?
Troll looked like he wasn't sure if he was going to laugh or cry.
Like what's she gonna do? Kill us with kindness? Bake us poisonous cookies and pies? Because honestly, I'd gladly die from eating too many sweets.
He licked his tusked mouth to further prove his point, drawing a small amount of laughter from his party members. That was the other thing that made these two groups stand out from most. Even though they had just nearly party-wiped, and a few of them had lost good chunks of experience, they were still having fun. It was parties like these two that really made James's life as a dungeon core extremely enjoyable. Well, them and the groups that stumbled across his mimics. His video of Dwight getting eaten by a mimic had been viewed by over 100,000 dungeon cores.
Maybe she's not the actual boss.
Z looked back at Troll.
Maybe she has a hidden dog named Courage that actually comes out to defend her when we move to the house.
Z's comment got chuckles from his party members and Rue. Scar's party and James just stared at him blankly. Guess that was another reference from way before James's time. Though he was starting to wonder just how much old-school pop culture Rue had been exposed to. What's he referencing? James's comment caused the pixie to let out a sigh as she shook her head.
You've got so much to learn.
She flicked her wrist, pulling up a small screen in front of the two of them.
It's a television show that was popular with kids and teens in the 90s and early 2000s.
Right. Well, might as well go see what all this is about.
Z motioned towards Oak, indicating for the Indra to take the lead. The party fanned out and took up their positions, preparing for any and all outcomes. As they neared the house, Grandma Jenkins looked up from the porch and offered the group a sweet smile.
Oh, look at all of you,
she called in a kind, elderly voice.
Are you all lost? Do you need help?
She stopped rocking and stood up shakily from her rocking chair. As she did, she set down the project she had been working on, resting her knitting needles atop the table by her chair. Oak paused and glanced back at the party. This was the first time a boss had spoken to them, the very first time they had encountered it. Their proximity to her also meant they could finally read her name, a fact that their reactions would betray. Sure enough, they were connecting the dots. Normally, James knew his boss's AI wouldn't be extremely advanced. However, as his research levels had increased, and as they progressed through the floors, Rue had informed him that the mobs on the floors, especially the bosses, would become intelligent and sentient much quicker. Old Man Jenkins, after all, had finally grown enough sentience that he was assigning a quest to players, asking them to help him get his farm back in line. Doing so got them a unique item from him and eliminated the need for them to kill him. Of course, most players still killed him after they completed the quest. Experience was experience, after all. The Terminus obviously had enhanced intellect, courtesy of the Leica Sir upgrade James had applied to it. When James had summoned Grandma Jenkins, she had been assigned a basic AI, which was quite simple. She could hold an all-right conversation, but wasn't much for complicated matters. James had needed that to change, mainly because if he was going to make the Jenkins family a thing, he wanted Grandma Jenkins to really be the start of it. Besides, they were already coaching Old Man Jenkins on the story they were building, but had just decided they could play his ignorance off as amnesia. A story he was starting to take to and tell adventurers already. So, as he had done with the Terminus, James had used a boss mob upgrade point on Grandma Jenkins, enhancing her intellect. The upgrade for her had been labeled Respect Your Elders and had given her a fancy pair of glasses that really seemed to enhance her facade. As with his second floor boss, her AI had immediately developed from that. After that, Rue had begun discussing their plan with their upcoming bosses with her, and the story they were going to slowly build over the floors. The plan, up to this point, was to make every odd-leveled floor boss a humanoid boss. They would then give the boss a name with Jenkins somewhere in there. From there, they would tell the story of a family that had become trapped within the dungeon, flung across all the floors. Some would have more tragic backstories than others, but it would all link back to the final member of the Jenkins family. the sole reason why they had all become trapped in the dungeon in the first place. A member of the family by the name of Leroy. Of course, Leroy's actual introduction into the game would likely be a long way away, as James wasn't aware of a level cap on dungeons or players yet, meaning he had many floors to go. Currently, they were going to play that Old Man Jenkins was married to Grandma Jenkins, and yet he had amnesia from being attacked when he was first sucked into the dungeon. Grandma Jenkins, on the other hand, had found herself in the swamp, armed only with her skills as a seamstress and magical knitting and sewing needles. With those, she created the monsters of the floor. The Teddy Knights helped her build her humble abode, and the others kept her safe and secure in this strange new world, which meant she wouldn't take kindly to any adventurers who made their way to her, as that would imply they'd just murdered her creations on their way there.
Tell me, children.
Grandma Jenkins looked sweetly down at all of the adventurers who were extremely uncertain about the entire situation. James knew if he was in their shoes, he would be too. This was definitely one of the weirdest things that had to be going on in DCO right now.
Have any of you come across my husband?
She glanced from player to player, eyeing them up and down. It was lucky for their party that they were no longer wearing their demonic farm gear. That had been one of the joke triggers they had agreed upon with the boss. Once again, the boss AIs for DCO seemed to give off quite a malicious aura when it came to the adventurers. James figured that had to mainly be part of the fact that their purpose was to continually fight and be killed by adventurers. That would be enough to make anyone dislike the given situation. The party still had no way to respond. At least, most of them didn't. What's he look like? Scar had advanced from his place with the party to move closer to Grandma Jenkins. He eyed her warily and kept his shield up, but at least had the sense to respond to her. In return, she smiled sweetly down at him.
Oh, well, you would know him if you saw him. An unfortunate magical accident years ago caused him to get sucked into a demonic realm. Before he completely disappeared, I saw him even growing horns.
She let out a sigh, shaking her head.
That man of mine, I swear he's the reason our grandson Leroy turned out like he did.
Scar looked back at the party and then towards Grandma Jenkins. Judging by the way his hand tightened on his shield and sword, he, like the others, had confirmed she was going to be the boss they had to face. Grandma Jenkins' smile turned from sweet to evil as she looked at their reactions.
Ah, I see you must have run into him. What a pity.
Behind her, the knitting needles she had set down began to glow. Maybe once or twice, Scar responded, and as he did, the party launched their attacks. They had sensed her obvious change in attitude, and they weren't about to let her get the first strike. It was a solid plan, in theory, and they executed it nicely. Magic and arrows and 2 glowing needles all flew towards Grandma Jenkins. That action, though, initiated combat with her and activated her unique passives. Even as the attacks hit her, taking the tiniest amount of health, given the fact her defense was currently too high for much of their damage to even seep through, her form began to fade away. At the same time, the knitting needles flew high into the sky, and a dome of thread erupted around the party, trapping them within. The puppet show had been activated, meaning they now had no chance but to fight for their lives.
Well, that's just unfortunate,
James whispered, as Grandma Jenkins' form completely disappeared. In its place was an adorable rabbit wearing a bow tie with a magician's top hat. The party stared at the strange bunny for a split second, shocked as it took off its hat and offered them a bow. The moment it reached its hand into its hat, the boss fight truly began. Chapter 44. It wasn't long before the 10-man strong group of adventurers was able to whittle the bunny boss mob down to half of its HP. After all, the magic wabbit, while having powerful spells, was a squishy caster. At that point, the fight began to tip out of their favor, and fast. Because the moment the magic wabbit hit 50% of its health, Grandma Jenkins' second ability and another of her unique passives activated. It began with her ability Quick Stitch Fix. Because the pet was brought down to 50% of its HP, Grandma Jenkins reappeared to fix her dear pet. This skill took 1 minute to fully heal the pet, leaving her vulnerable at this time. Of course, the game mechanics played around that fact as she brought an additional pet with her when she reappeared as well. This additional pet was randomly chosen from her other two mobs, though James knew either option would spell trouble for the raid party. When Grandma Jenkins appeared and they launched an attack at her, not what it seems activated. Even as the raid party watched Grandma Jenkins appear beside the magic wabbit, sewing needles in hand to begin stitching her mob, along with a 1-minute timer, a second form seemed to leap free from her very shadow. The second mob to join the fray, Tiger, was there. At the same time, 10 sewing needles, courtesy of the Sound of Silence, flew from Grandma Jenkins towards all of the adventurers, while an 11th, carrying a single red thread, Thread of Fate, flew towards Olivia. The 10 sewing needles rushed towards the adventurers and attempted to sew their mouths shut. Judging by the look of pure horror on the adventurers' faces as they tried their best to stop the needles, it was not a pleasant experience. Luckily, Med-Ick was quick to think, and his form began to glow with a soft golden light as the needles rushed at him and his friends. He burned his mass cleanse cooldown, which burned all of the silencing threads away. The red thread, however, remained. It wrapped itself around Olivia's left arm until the needle punched into her chest right where her heart was. The healer called out in surprise, grasping at the thread as she tried to pull it away, but after a moment she seemed to realize it had not caused her any damage. What's more, the thread didn't seem to cause any debuff. However, the moment it attached itself to Olivia, James and the others saw a single red counter appear next to Grandma Jenkins' name. James knew what the counter was for. The adventurers did not. Though anyone who had ever played an MMO knew anything that seemed like a stack when it came to boss mobs was bad news and needed to be avoided. James was extremely curious to see what the Thread of Fate would actually summon, but as Tiger joined the fray, he knew he wouldn't get to see all 5 threads. The fuzzy tiger pounced on Med-Ick the moment after the healer used his mass cleanse. The feline boss's paw flashed for a moment with light, signaling it was about to land a critical hit, before its claws slashed completely through the High Cleric, leaving a floating orb in its place. If that wasn't enough, it seemed the magic wabbit could still attack while he was being healed, as a lightning bolt crackled from the top hat he carried, smashing directly into No More, who had 2 of his glowing needles in hand, prepared to throw at the feline that had one-shot Med-Ick. The electrical energy smashed through his small form and arched thematically for a moment between the 2 needles he was carrying, before he too poofed into a floating orb. 2 adventurers down, 8 to go. Z and Scar tried their best to reorganize their team members, as veteran MMO players are keen to do. Oak rushed towards the tiger and unleashed a taunt of electrical energy of his own, even as he yelled something strange about a 100-acre wood. Meanwhile, Scar positioned himself in front of Olivia, watching to protect the healer as she tried to resurrect Med-Ick and get the second healer back in the fight. Z ordered the rest of the players to all converge on the magic wabbit, hoping to kill the bunny before it got fully healed. James had to admit it was definitely a solid plan. The bunny's biggest advantage was its ability to go invisible and its high movement speed. However, it seemed that while it was being healed, it could not move too far from Grandma Jenkins, nor could it go invisible. It could still sling spells from its hat, though, which it did, as arrows, axes, and magical attacks rained down upon it. The exchange was definitely impressive to watch, even though James already knew the outcome. The adventurers were level 33 and below. Grandma Jenkins was level 44, and her pets were level 39. There were some obstacles in a game that just couldn't be overcome by pure skill. Oak quickly found that Tiger was able to do a lot more damage to him than he expected, and he activated both of his massive cooldowns in order to try and go toe-to-toe with the boss pet mob. Unfortunately for him, because his Indra cooldown increased the number of attacks he could make on the Tiger boss, that also meant the boss's unique trait, cat-like reflexes, had increased chances to trigger, which was bad news for Oak. By the time everyone had exhausted their cooldowns and attacks, Oak was nearly dead, Med-Ick was resurrected, and half the other party members were below half-life from the magical attacks of the magic wabbit. However, they had managed to get it down to less than a fifth of its life. Unfortunately for them, the minute of healing passed, and James watched as Grandma Jenkins finished one last stitch on her pet bunny, before it glowed suddenly with a golden light and its health reached full again. With her rabbit healed, Grandma Jenkins once again faded away, laughing evilly as she did. She left the adventurers alone and disheartened, with a fully healed magic wabbit and a barely damaged tiger. They didn't survive to see her summoned again, as the magic wabbit had regained all his MP as well when he was healed. Between his magical barrage and Tiger's perfect strike, the raid team was quickly turned into a crowd of glowing orbs. The moment Scar, who was the last adventurer standing, was slain, the thread walls that formed the puppet show faded away, and Grandma Jenkins walked casually past the floating orbs of light back to her rocking chair. From there, she looked down at the orbs, which had a few more minutes before they would be returned back to the entrance to the 3rd floor, with their time penalty applied.
Please, don't be strangers, dearies. I do so love visitors.
Her voice echoed out in the dull swamps in a way only a creepy old grandma's voice could. Then she began to rock slowly back and forth, her wooden chair creaking ever so slightly as she began to hum to herself. As the adventurer's orbs disappeared, James just sat there, staring at the monster he had created. If he could get Grandma Jenkins summoned during the dungeon wars, he could only imagine the nightmare it would create on the battlefield. Not only that, but he could also tell from Z's eyes before the adventurer fell that he intended to grow as strong as he could before the dungeon wars started. Because if there was one thing James knew about Z and his guild, it was that they did not like finding a challenge they couldn't overcome. Chapter 45. From blank. Subject: The time has come. Glyax, we have noticed you have not shared your stream since logging back into DCO. If you believe this will enable you to surprise us with your 3rd floor, know that it is a fruitless effort. No matter what your dungeon type would call forth for your 3rd floor, your mobs and players will not be able to stop us. Blank is coming for you, and by the end of this war, your core will be destroyed. If you foolishly believe you can withstand our might, we welcome your presence on the battlefield. Pray that your players summon your avatar quickly so we may clash in the fields of battle, so that Blank can bring about your demise with our own hands. Enjoy these next 2 days as our dungeons embark upon their war, for on the 3rd day we will defeat you, and on the 5th day we will destroy you. Blank does not lose. Wow, they really are full of themselves. James closed the message he had received mere moments before and glanced at the timer. There were 5 minutes remaining before the 3rd day of the immersion cycle for James would begin, meaning the dungeon war would start. They were accurate in their assessment that James had purposefully not been streaming his 3rd floor over the last 24 hours. As much as he loved his stream, he had decided to keep it down in order to at least give himself a little secrecy. While it wouldn't offer much of an advantage, since Blank had likely already watched all of his previous streams, he figured a little surprise never hurt anything. Blank might know what his boss's tricks were for his 1st and 2nd floor, but at least Grandma Jenkins and his stuffed animals would be a surprise. So far, likely because of the impending war, James's own players, thankfully, hadn't been making thread posts about the 3rd floor either. The other reason he hadn't streamed the last 24 hours was because what he really didn't want Blank viewing was the progress of his players. Sure, Blank would see his players as they invaded and defended during the dungeon wars over the next 2 days, but James knew that type of observation would be different from how his players normally interacted. If, and it was a big if, James was expecting his players to have a pivotal role in the dungeon wars, they needed to at least be offered as much secrecy as they could so that they could surprise Blank. Blank's message also confirmed what James had already assessed about Blank. They were taking matters into their own hands and intended to waltz all over the battlefield in their avatars. Sure, they weren't going to completely dismiss their players, but he figured they were probably going to treat the players as pawns or fodder and take it upon themselves to control the battlefield. A completely different playstyle than James intended to adopt, especially considering James's avatar class required him to empower others to help him win.
Just means it is going to be all the sweeter when we kill their avatar.
Rue was back in her pixie battle armor, her eyes watching the countdown timer as it ticked down. They had done all they could during the last 24 hours after they watched the raid parties fight against Grandma Jenkins. James had prepared his loot rewards for his players for turning in essence, and made a small list of possible options for building with his BP as he got them. After that, he had upgraded his third floor a little more, adding in more actual reptiles and amphibians, including more anacondas and a few other snake species. From there, he had tried to fiddle around with his mob upgrades before stopping himself. He figured it would be counterintuitive to make his floor harder on his own players while they were trying their hardest to level before the dungeon wars. Because of that, and because James could feel his nerves getting to him, he had decided to sleep for the last 8 hours before the dungeon wars truly began. The sleep within immersion offered him a sweet, blissful escape into darkness as the hours passed. When he awoke, he not only felt well rested, but energized for the upcoming war. That feeling had passed to dread as he saw he had a private message from Blank waiting for him. It was clear Xander's children were extremely confident. James was sure that this was not only a result of being raised by Xander, but also likely their personalities in general. After all, some power gamers developed god complexes, especially now. When you spent more time, in a sense, immersed in a world where you constantly beat down other people and stood above them, well, it was easy to let that go to your head. Which of course meant a lot of the pro gamers, which he was certain Blank was, lacked humility. James was guilty of that as well at times, and he knew that. However, likely due to his experiences with Dwight in the real world, he had humbled himself and come to understand that even though everything within the games felt real, they were still just games. There was a real world, and in it there were always consequences, and others better than you. Evil people existed, and they could and would do terrible things for no reason. Because of that, James liked to do what he could in games to help others, rather than become like the people who had tormented him. However, as had been evident when he first encountered Xander, when the developer had threatened Rue, James still also had a Superman complex at times. Obviously, his AI had the same complex too, which was why they were now about to embark on a challenge that literally would decide their future within DCO. The more he thought on it, as he glanced at the timer and back to Rue, the more he could feel his nerves going wild. The next 5 days in this virtual world, a mere 5 hours outside in the real world, would decide his fate. As the minutes ticked by, he pulled up his message menu. To Blank. Subject, Deus Ex Machina. You pride yourselves as being brilliant, undefeatable gamers. You accuse me of cheating the system, of somehow gaining an unfair edge, which has allowed me to take the spot as the second highest ranked dungeon in DCO. But let me set a few things straight. First, I did not cheat. Obviously, you have a great understanding of DCO. You know how vast this game is. Don't you think there might be ways for others to get advantages, such as I did, without cheating? Besides, why the hell would I cheat in a game that I am already doing great in? Second, if anyone should be called out for cheating, it should be you two. I know who you are. I know all about you. Don't you think your father gives you an unfair advantage? Honestly, the reason I didn't call you out on that before was because I was afraid. Afraid of your father, afraid of what he could do to me. But let's just say, for reasons, I'm no longer afraid. Third, you should be ashamed about using that username. I've seen the show, I've read the light novels. You don't deserve that name. Sora and Shiro are so much better than you two ever could wish to be. You're just arrogant little pricks. Finally, I look forward to this dungeon war. I look forward to seeing your faces as my dungeon, my players, and my mobs take you down. It is time you learned that gaming is about more than just being the best. There is so much more to life than overwhelming sheer power or skill. Maybe my dungeon can teach you that. If not, then it doesn't matter, but at least I can say I tried. If I win, hopefully you and your family will finally leave me alone. Ascente. Glyax. Rue grinned at James as he finished his message. From her eyes and smile, he could tell she approved of his message. He clicked send and watched as the last few seconds before the dungeon war counted down. It was time. Chapter 46. Server alert. A dungeon war has been started. This war will last a total of 5 days. For the next 2 days, players from the enemy dungeon will be able to invade your dungeon. Likewise, you will be able to invade the enemy dungeon. Do your best to survive the onslaught and overcome your foe. To the victors, the great spoils of war will be revealed. The message flowed across James's screen the moment the timer hit 0. Likewise, he could see all of his players pause and look down at their own message screens, likely seeing the same message flow across. At the same time, a single message in red appeared in front of him. Core livestream active. It seemed that not only was the dungeon war going to be live streamed to all of the other players, but the core aspect of it was going to forcibly be streamed to the rest of the dungeon cores as well. That was fine, because even though it meant Blank could see what he was doing, it meant he could watch them as well. James excitedly pulled up his core chat menu, pulling up the main page. There, in bold letters, it exclaimed the start of the very first ever dungeon war. Below the exclamation, 2 screenshots were shown. The first was of James's dungeon, as he would recognize the fearsome view of the terminus anywhere. The other screenshot showed a giant gummy bear? If he had to guess, the screenshots were of boss mobs for each dungeon. However, did Blank really have a gummy bear as a boss mob? That seemed a bit out of character. Both screenshots had a watch option, with a little red dot showing they were currently live streaming. Excitedly, James rubbed his tentacles together before he clicked on the stream for Blank. He could not wait to finally see... Error. Dungeon War participants are unable to watch the core live stream. James stared at the message for a moment before he let out a sigh. It made sense. If they wanted the dungeon war to be fair, or at least as fair as could be in the given circumstances, it wouldn't be right for the participants to be able to spy on each other. Instead, James would have to just watch his dungeon as Blank's players invaded, and hopefully he could watch his own players invade Blank's dungeon. A part of James was actually glad he and Blank wouldn't be able to watch each other's streams of their actions. It meant Blank wouldn't be able to see what James had planned for his 3rd and 5th day placements. It also meant his avatar information and anything else he looked at or did during the next 2 days would remain a secret from Blank. Something that James was actually quite thankful for. Server announcement. Invasion gates will become active in 5 minutes. Another message flitted across his stream, and James looked anxiously at Rue. The war had just started, and already the first invasion gates were about to go live. He knew they would activate every 2 hours and would create a gate on each floor. His players would be able to take parties of up to 10 through the gates to invade the enemy dungeon. Likewise, the enemy dungeon could invade his instances with parties of 10. The instance invaders arrived in would be completely random, though, so it was a toss-up on which adventurers would be available to defend against the invasion. James did a quick scan of his dungeon, checking the instances he currently had up. His instances were maxed out, with players steadily grinding away. According to Rue, many of his players had actually stayed awake during the past 24 hours, grinding out as many levels as they could and upgrading their gear. From what Rue had overheard, some enterprising merchants had even begun cutting deals or adjusting prices in order to sell their wares even quicker. Needless to say, the upcoming war was driving the economy. He ran a name search, seeing if Z or Scar's parties were in the dungeon, and was dismayed to see that neither party was currently in an instance.